You wouldn't believe me if I told you, but at 70, I'd never felt more alive. Not until Nico walked into my life. Miami has a way of making you feel timeless if you let it. Glamour, beauty, excess, it's all part of the air here, and I was no stranger to that life. I'd lived in one of the city's most exclusive estates for years, wrapped in wealth and the quiet echo of my own footsteps. But all the opulence, all the pristine walls and perfect ocean views couldn't fill the growing emptiness that had settled in my life. Then came Nico. It was my daughter's friend who first mentioned him, in that offhand way, saying he was the kind of man who knew how to treat a woman right. She didn't know I'd call. She couldn't have imagined that, but loneliness makes you bold, and there was something thrilling about the idea. I'd never done anything like this, but I dialed his number before I could talk myself out of it. When I opened the door that evening, Nico was everything and more. Tall, dark, sculpted in a way that felt both powerful and intoxicatingly sensual. I'd seen attractive men, of course, but he was different. His gaze wasn't just looking at me, it was devouring me, seeing through my skin and bones to something beneath, something I hadn't felt in years, and it ignited something in me. "Miss Lydia," he said, his voice a low, smooth rumble that sent a shiver up my spine. "It's a pleasure." I could barely breathe. The words tumbled out of me before I realized what I was saying. "The pleasure's all mine, and please just call me Lydia." I'd arranged for a simple evening champagne, some light conversation, but the tension between us was immediate, thick as honey. I offered him a glass and he took it, but his eyes stayed locked on mine, smoldering with a heat that made my pulse quicken. I could feel my heart racing, my palms slick with a nervousness I hadn't felt in years. "Do you do this often?" I asked, swirling my champagne, trying to maintain a sense of control. He leaned back, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Enough to know what I'm doing. But I have to admit, Lydia, I've never had a client quite like you." That was it. The floodgates opened. That was it. The floodgates opened. I felt myself leaning in, a mixture of excitement and disbelief washing over me. At my age, I wasn't used to being wanted. Admired, yes. Respected, certainly. But wanted. It was a long-forgotten feeling, and Nico had stirred it up in me like a match to gasoline. "How much do I owe you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, already knowing the answer. "Usually, it's 1,000 for the night," he replied, his tone smooth, casual. But I saw the way his gaze flickered over me, lingering just a bit too long on the curve of my neck, the dip of my collarbone. He wanted me, and he wasn't hiding it. I could have left it at that, paid the usual price and let things unfold, but I didn't want usual. I wanted all of him, every ounce of that hunger I saw simmering beneath the surface. "Then I'll pay 5, I said, setting my glass down, heart pounding as I watched his expression shift from surprise to something far darker, more intense. He didn't argue. He didn't question it. Instead, he leaned in closer, his hand brushing lightly over mine, the warmth of his skin sending a jolt of anticipation through me. "5 it is," he murmured, his voice low and intoxicating, and from that moment on I was his. That night was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Nico was all passion, all fire, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was being seen, truly seen. His touch was firm yet tender, guiding me into a world I hadn't known existed. He was attentive, his gaze locked onto mine with an intensity that left me breathless. Every move, every whispered word, it was like he was weaving a spell around me, making me forget everything but him. When I finally lay there beside him, wrapped in the sheets with the faint hum of Miami's nightlife in the distance, I felt alive. Not just alive, but desired, cherished in a way that transcended our age difference, the transaction that had started it all. Nico had given me more than I'd expected, more than I'd thought I deserved. And so, I called him again and again. Each night with him was a fresh dose of vitality, a reminder that I was still a woman, still capable of passion and desire. He became my addiction, the thrill I craved in the silence of my expansive home. And I paid him handsomely for every visit, never blinking at the cost. 5,000, 10,000, whatever it took to keep him coming back. It was nothing to me, just numbers on a screen. Zeros I barely felt. But for Nico, I could tell it was different. At first, he seemed flattered, even eager, leaning into the allure of luxury I offered him. I'd buy him gifts, an elegant watch, designer suits, anything he wanted. He'd accept them with a charming grin, a sparkle in his eye that made me feel like a queen. But then, the glimmer started to fade. The glimmer started to fade. I noticed it one night, as he slipped on the custom-tailored suit I'd bought him just days before. He was polite, yes, and he smiled when I complimented how it fit him, but there was something distant in his gaze, a flicker of boredom. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was just imagining things, that the intensity between us hadn't lessened. But deep down, I knew better. He began coming less frequently, finding reasons to decline my invitations. "I've got something tonight, Lydia," he'd say, or "next time, okay?" The excuses stung, and each one only fueled my desperation to keep him close, to bring back that look in his eyes. So I upped the ante. I knew he had a taste for the finer things, and I used it to my advantage. I bought him an even more expensive watch, one with a face that gleamed under the light, diamonds inlaid around the edges. I practically threw gifts at him, anything to keep him coming back, anything to keep him tethered to me. It worked, but not in the way I'd hoped. He took the gifts, the cash, the lavish dinners, but the warmth, the passion, they were slipping further and further away. I couldn't deny it anymore. Nico was only here for the money. Yet, even knowing that, I couldn't let him go. He'd become the pulse of my days, the thrill that got me out of bed each morning. Every time he finally gave in and showed up at my door, I felt that rush again, that intoxicating blend of excitement and longing. But he wasn't the same. Where once he would pull me close, now he'd pull away. His kisses were no longer hungry, his touch no longer urgent. He'd make excuses, mutter something about being tired, his eyes darting away as if he couldn't bear to look at me too long. And still I clung to him, begged for more of those nights that made me feel alive. I clung to him with a desperation that surprised even me. Every time he tried to pull away, I found a new way to reel him back in. I'd remind him of the things I'd given him, the lifestyle I was offering him, and if that didn't work, I'd slip another few thousand into his pocket, a little bonus to sweeten the deal. I could see him hesitating, the conflict in his eyes as he weighed his reluctance against the lure of easy money. And when he finally stayed, when he finally agreed to spend the night, it was different. His movements were rehearsed, his touch mechanical. I tried to ignore it, tried to pretend it was just my imagination, but the truth was undeniable. Nico was there, but his mind was somewhere else. One night, as he sat on the edge of the bed, adjusting the watch I'd bought him, I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. He tensed, the muscles in his back tight under my fingers, and I felt a pang of sadness, of something bordering on humiliation. "Nico," I murmured, hoping my voice didn't betray the vulnerability I felt. Is this too much for you?" He turned, giving me a look that was both pitying and frustrated, his dark eyes searching mine, as if trying to find the right words. "Lydia, it's just, I appreciate everything, but maybe it's time you—" His voice trailed off, and the words he left unsaid hung heavy in the air. But I couldn't bear the thought of him leaving. I couldn't face the empty silence that would fill the house if he were gone. So I did what I knew best. I reached for my purse, pulling out a wad of cash, pressing it into his hand before he could refuse. "Stay," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, Nico, just stay." He looked at the cash in his hand, then back at me, and I could see the battle raging within him. I knew, deep down, that he wanted to walk out, to leave this mansion and never look back. But the money had its own allure, and for a moment he hesitated. I held my breath, waiting, hoping, praying that he'd stay. Then he sighed, stuffing the cash into his pocket, and gave me a strained smile. "All right, Lydia," he murmured, his voice resigned. "I'll stay." But the truth was clear. He wasn't staying for me. He was staying for the money, for the endless stream of luxuries I could provide. And that knowledge tore at me, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I had him, even if only by the thinnest thread, and that was enough. The weeks turned into a blur. I showered him with gifts, things that grew more extravagant with each visit: a gold watch, a designer leather jacket, even a new sports car. Anything to keep him interested, to keep him bound to me. And each time he looked at me with those tired, detached eyes, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. But I ignored it, clinging to the illusion, telling myself that it was worth it, that he'd eventually come around. One night, I even threw a lavish party, just for the two of us. I had the house filled with flowers, the best champagne chilling, a private chef preparing a 5-course meal. Nico showed up, dressed in the designer suit I'd bought him, looking every bit the part of a man who was deeply invested. But the moment he stepped inside, I could tell he was only going through the motions. I tried everything that night, every charm, every flirtatious smile, even every soft, whispered plea. But no matter what I did, he remained cold, distant, his mind clearly somewhere else. And when I reached for his hand, pulling him close, he stiffened, his eyes darting away. "Nico," I whispered, pressing myself against him. "Am I enough for you?" For a moment he looked at me, really looked at me, and in his gaze, I saw something raw, something honest. "Lydia," he said, his voice barely a murmur, "you don't need me. You've got everything, and yet you're using me to fill a hole that can't be filled." The words stung, but I didn't let them deter me. I refused to let him go, not after everything I'd done to keep him close. So I kissed him, pulling him down into that twisted intimacy that had come to define our relationship. And he allowed it, his touch lifeless, his movements mechanical. But he stayed. He stayed because I made it worth his while. As the months dragged on, I noticed small things going missing, nothing major at first. A bracelet here, a pair of earrings there. I dismissed it as my own forgetfulness, chalking it up to the chaos Nico had brought into my once ordered life. But deep down, a nagging feeling began to stir, one I tried to ignore. I wanted to believe that Nico was with me because he cared, that all the money and gifts were just icing on the cake. But reality has a way of shattering even the most beautiful illusions. Then, one morning I woke up to find him gone. gone, the house was eerily quiet, a silence that felt almost unnatural. I walked through the halls, expecting to see him lounging somewhere or fixing himself a coffee, but there was nothing. I called his name, my voice echoing through the empty rooms, but he didn't answer. When I finally made it to my bedroom, my heart sank. My jewelry box was open, and nearly every piece was missing: rings, bracelets, the diamond necklace I'd bought myself as a reminder of a life well lived. Everything was gone. My hands shook as I began to search the room, pulling open drawers, checking every hiding place I could think of. And then I noticed the safe. I punched in the code, my pulse hammering in my ears. When the door clicked open, my heart dropped. The cash I kept there, $300,000 I'd set aside for emergencies, was gone. My head spun as I realized what had happened. Nico had taken it all. The jewelry, the cash, everything. The man I'd spent a fortune trying to keep close had disappeared, leaving me with a loss totaling $2 million. In that moment, the weight of my foolishness hit me with crushing force. He'd never cared about me, not truly. I was just another wealthy woman with more money than sense, blinded by her own desperation. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the realization settling over me like a suffocating blanket. Nico had used me, just as I'd used him. And now he was gone, leaving me with nothing but the memories of a reckless affair and the sting of betrayal. I'd spent my life building walls of wealth around me, but in the end they'd only trapped me in my own loneliness. And as I sat there in my empty, silent home, I couldn't help but laugh, a hollow, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. I'd lost more than just money. I'd lost the last shred of my dignity and the dream of feeling loved, even if only for a moment. In the end, all I had left was a lesson I'd learned far too late. Trust can't be bought, and love isn't something you can take off a shelf, no matter how much you're willing to pay.